Hi, welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Each week, I answer a film-related question submitted by you, our BMFI patrons. If you have a film-related question you'd like to see me try to answer, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and use the Ask Andrew form. Now, on to today's question. Jerry asks, for a long time, Citizen Kane was named as the greatest film of all time by Sight and Sound's International Critics Poll. In 2012, it was overtaken by Vertigo. What's the significance of this? What are the arguments for each? Well, Jerry, it is true that Citizen Kane was for decades viewed as the greatest film ever made, and it was overtaken by Vertigo. I think the sort of shift in between those two titles is, not tremendously significant. I think it more than anything marks a sort of changing of the guard of the kind of, higher echelons of the film criticism establishment. I think you could easily imagine, and of course, I'm just kind of making informed speculation here, I don't know for certain. You could easily imagine, though, how if you look at Vertigo and you look at Citizen Kane, even though they're released fewer than 20 years apart, they do seem to belong to different eras. And I think it's easy to imagine that a sort of newer generation of critics might prefer the newer film, even though by today's standards and by 2012 standards, it wouldn't seem like a newer contemporary film. But it seems newer and more contemporary than Citizen Kane. I think there are some other changes that can perhaps account for this shift as well. One is the changes in Hollywood. While both films are about, if we want to boil it down into the sort of simplest context, about the flaws of men, I think that Citizen Kane is about the successes and failures of one man, a great man, albeit one based, to some varying degrees, depending on who you ask, William Randolph Hearst, but sort of, the story of the rise and fall and successes and failures of a titan is a very sort of Hollywood story to make. And it's very much of that time, of an era that was making films about George M. Cohan and all sorts of painters and artists and other figures, young Mr. Lincoln and so on. Vertigo is also about the flaws of a man, but it's about the flaws of an ordinary man and the flaws and weaknesses that ordinary man has that are sort of presumably by extension present in many men, in many people to varying degrees. And this was one of the great sort of secrets to Alfred Hitchcock's success, the way that he tended to be able to depict human foibles that humans rarely want to discuss or see displayed in his films, but wrapped in sort of storytelling that was exciting and suspenseful and visually interesting and all of that. But I think the shift between the two movies from sort of a great man and the challenges and the flaws and the successes and the vanity of a great man versus the very human flaws of an ordinary man, I think that shift is an understandable one. I also think there is a darkness, even though Charles Foster Kane does some unsavory things and is in many ways a very unsavory fellow. I think there's a different level of psychological darkness to Vertigo that is seen as being of a more contemporary sensibility. I also think that though at the time it was made, Citizen Kane was visually revolutionary, cinematographically, groundbreaking. I think it doesn't seem that way today as much as, or in as clear a way or as obvious a way as Vertigo does. And I think that could be part of it as well. In terms of the arguments for each movie, that is a challenge. I think I've sort of made some of those implicitly, and in what I've said so far. And frankly, I think the things that the movies have in common that I've mentioned are arguments for their relative successes. I do think that the fact that Alfred Hitchcock has grown in prominence and recognition to achieve the levels of notoriety that he has and to be held in the esteem that he has as a filmmaker. Even though Orson Welles is an exceptional filmmaker in his own right, his body of work, the troubles he had making and completing films, his relatively limited filmography, I think are sort of marks against him and marks in favor of Hitchcock. But I think that, as with so many questions about movies, part of this debate boils down to personal preference. What do you want your movies to be? What do you think your movies should be? What do you think are the elements of a great film? To me personally, now Sight and Sound isn't interested in American movies only. And perhaps that is another thing in the view of the poll against Citizen Kane. I think Citizen Kane's a very American story. I think there are titans of industry and successes and failures and vanities and all that, obviously around the world, but there's something very American about the specific trajectory of Charles Foster Kane and the situations he finds himself in, etc. Vertigo, I don't think, has any connection to being specifically American. And I think that could be another change in the film's relative esteem. And also, depending on the case you want to make for or against the movies, I think that's a difference in that regard as well. But an interesting question, and the real interesting question will be, is there going to be a film that comes out after, that has come out in the many decades since Vertigo was released, that's going to overtake Vertigo? I guess when that happens, I will have another question to answer. And if you have any film-related questions you'd like me to answer, please consider submitting them via the Ask Andrew form on the Film Studies Online section at brynmarfilm.org.